Hello everyone, this is Dr. Bilge Azgan and welcome back to lecture 6. In the previous lecture, as you would remember, we talked about Plato and Aristotle, the ancient philosophers, and we talk about how they perceived the ideal state, how Plato has a different idea of what ideal state should be, and Aristotle has a completely different one. And as you could remember, Aristotle thought about the 6 regimes. He classified 6 regimes, 3 of them as good and 3 of them as bad. If you look at the lecture 5, you can see all these. Now, certainly classification, Plato had a different idea about ideal state. Philosophers should be kings, kings should be philosophers, whereas Aristotle had no interest in the world of ideas, in the other world, but he only looked around and he classified them. Well, guess what? We always classify things in politics. Political regime classification has not certainly ended with Aristotle. It started with Aristotle. Aristotle is one of those who, for the first time, tried to classify political regimes according to criteria that he had developed. And as you could remember, his criteria was 2. How many it's ruled, how many people is ruling it, a given country or a system, how they are ruling it, who is benefiting. Are they ruling to benefit their own interest, or they are ruling to benefit the common interest? And that was a critical distinction that Aristotle used to distinguish the good regimes from the bad regime types. Okay? And from then on, we have a lot of classifications. In this lecture 6 and lecture 7, we will continue these classifications. Certainly, the classifications that Aristotle used for the first time back in 400 BC is outdated now. It's still used, but we have more classifications, more prominent classifications that shapes the modern world today. And we have ideologies now. We have ideologies that are a set of belief systems and ideas about how things should be, how the states should run, how society should be, how it should be run. And so in this lecture, we will talk about, since it's an introduction to political science, to ideologies. All right? Isms, ideologies such as liberalism, if you ever heard of it. It's introduction to political science, so it's okay that you hear it now. We have ideologies such as liberalism. We have ideologies such as socialism. We have ideology called communism. We have ideology called libertarianism. We have ideology called communism. We have a lot of isms, A lot of isms in politics. But what do we mean by this guy is leftist? Or what do we mean by it's a right-wing government, or left-wing government, or social democrat government, or moderate government, or liberal government? These are the terminology that they are using all the time in the news around. If you study any country around in the politics, they are using these labels all the time. But what are they? Where they come from? What do they exactly mean? And this lecture is designed to give you the basics of it. So how we decide if a given government or a person or an ideology is a right-wing ideology or it's a left-wing? Well, we have 2 common methods. The classifying ideologies. Will we call it left and right continue, And what does left represent politically and economically? And what does right represent politically and economically? We will give more details, but that's where we start. Where did this left of right thing started? This left wing or right wing? It started with the French Revolution, which I lectured in lecture 4. I told you that the commons came out and they said that we want a change, that we don't want any more privileges, and we want everyone to be free, right, equal, and brotherhood. And back then, when there was a crisis and when they were sitting on the National Assembly in France during the French Revolution, those who brought the old order down, who pushed for the French Revolution, were sitting at the left of the room of the assembly, and the aristocrats and the church who wanted to continue the old order, the ancient regime, what we call the old order, being the king absolute and the aristocrats and church having the privileges, they were sitting on the right. So that's where that distinction came. Left wanted a change, whereas right wanted a status quo. And since then, this left-right thing have been quite decisive in shaping political parties, in shaping attitudes, in shaping belief systems. All right? Following the French Revolution, the left and the right came to represent attitudes about change and the status quo. Status quo. The status quo is a Latin word. It means the way things are. All right? So the left in French Revolution wanted to change the way things were or the way things are, whereas the right wanted to keep the way things are. Yes? Here you can see those who demanded change were on the left. Yes. Of course, the left back in French Revolution, they were also divided among themselves as radicals and moderates. Some of them wanted to pursue a moderate change in a moderate degree. Some of them wanted to change things very radically. So we also have a distinction within the left, just like we have it in the right. And then in the center, what we usually call are the moderates, who generally supports the status quo and only minor change. On the right, conservative forces maintaining status quo, the way things are. And then we also have reactionaries, what we call the extreme right, which calls for the return to the ways of the past. So here, with the French Revolution, we have already a vocabulary of what is left, of what is right, what is moderate, the middle, and what is extreme right and what is extreme radical left. Radical right always seeks to return to past, keep the things the same they are. Radical left wants to things change radically. Okay, that's why they are radical, because they support a radical change in things, in the way things are. Well, what is the change we are talking about, though? That's another thing that we need to configure. So yes, here was I was talking about. Now you can see extreme left. Look, left-right continuum in the 19th century, as you can see from the nodes. We have extreme left, radicals, far-reaching changes, very radical, all right? We have left, which is progressive, center. We have right, conservatives, favored maintaining status quo, and extreme right, reactionary, okay? And of course, as I told you, the left-right continuum classifies also the attitudes. For instance, if you are left wing, or if you are a moderate left, or if you are a, more to the left of the center, that you can see, it's more likely. It is not more likely, but it is because you support human rights, more equal society, more free society, liberty, and internationalism, right? So that's basically the values of the left that the left parties claim. We have left parties or social democrat parties because those parties claim to have more rights, workers' rights, more social welfare, diminish the inequality, economic inequality in the country, promote human rights, civil liberties, and they have an international outlook in the sense that they want a more, they want a world that is based on cooperation with other countries, internationalism. They are more cosmopolitan. At least they support those values, all right? So those are the main distinguishing features and values that makes the left wing, because I'm sure you're reading radical left, this, that, and then where they're coming from and what they represent. Okay, this is what they represent. Well, and of course, this is the left-right continuum in the 19th century in Europe. When we look at the right, we read elitism, authoritarianism, nationalism, and property rights. Why? Because aristocrats didn't want to give up their property to have a more distributive and more egalitarian land share in given countries. Aristocrats wanted to keep their privileges. So that's why it's elitist, because aristocrats are privileged. They are aristocrat, and they would like to keep their privileges by being elitist. And those who rebel against them, or those who advocate that the lands should not be controlled by a few percent of aristocrats in the country, what do? They suppress those. They suppress those ideals, right? They suppress those political demands for equality and human rights and more sharing society. So that's why they are called authoritarian. And unlike the extreme left and right, where left is in favor of internationalism, the right wing is more pro-nationalist. And these are the four values of the things. Okay? And well, we have a left-right in the 20th century. Of course, it's a more comprehensive view of the modern spectrum. Okay, we have extreme left, center, right, and extreme right. But then we have kind of more values to it. But it's very similar values. We will come to that. We will engage with it more. So social change, as you can see again, social change towards the left and authority to the right. And the people who are, now we are coming to ideologies, more ideologies. Extreme left, we call it communism or anarchism. The ideologies that are called communist and anarchist are regarded at the continuum of the extreme left. And socialist are considered at the left. Center are liberalism. It's kind of the center of those two values that for we distinguish. And the right wings are called conservatives because they want to conserve things. They want to remain the status quo. And extreme right is fascism. And fascism is an ideology that came to Europe in 1920s with Italians fascism, with Mussolini, and then we had the Nazi Germany in 1930s. And then of course we had the extreme, in the extreme left, we had the Stalin Soviet Union. They were all not like Nazi Germany, although it was extreme left, it was a totalitarian regime, just like the Nazi Germany. Although one of them is at the spectrum of the right, the extreme right, the Nazi Germany, fascist. The Stalin's Russia was communist at the extreme left, although they were different at the different spectrum, at the completely opposite, because they were both extremes, they were totalitarian in the same way. All right, so let's talk about the first thing that we start, the economic continuum. That's one of the key things that distinguishes ideologies. And you should ask this question: should wealth be distributed equally among all social groups by restricting or eliminating private ownership of property? Or should economic decisions be made in the marketplace with varying degrees of government intervention? And that's one of the things that should be taken into account when we distinguish certain party or certain individual as left, more towards left or more towards right. Well, why? Because left, more towards more left, they are more in favor of more distribution of wealth more equally. Okay? And back then in 20th century, they claimed that the only way to achieve this was through state ownership of industries or railroads or natural resources. Now that kind of changed, but the left now is more interested in putting distributive justice at work. That is, taxing the rich more and not taxing the poor, taxing the rich much higher and taking the money, the taxes from the rich and trying to distribute it as a welfare, such as hospitals, education, that will get benefit to the middle class and the lower class in that society. So basically the left now is more interested in using the government to tax the rich much more so that they can distribute it among the population equally. Whereas, of course, right wing wouldn't want that, because right wing wants to be, because the right wing is about status quo mainly, and usually they are rich people, or they represent that richness. They don't want government to implement taxes on the rich. They rather claim that taxing the rich brings them down, so you should let them explore more, win more, and by them winning more, that will create more jobs and more opportunities. It will somehow get down, triple down, or dwindle down the society as the rich gets richer. Well, in 21st century that we live today, for the last 30 years, if you look at the trend, the gap between rich and poor is increasing. It's not getting less, it's getting bigger. And this is a worldwide phenomenon. It's happening in US, it's happening in China. Well, and you can see that in the latest elections of the United States, Obama, who were a Democrat, Democrat in US represent the liberals at the center and the center left. So Obama had a healthcare system for those who did not, for those who couldn't afford. He had a healthcare system. He devoted much more money to the federal, to the education. Whereas the Trump, who just won the elections against Hillary Clinton, of course, is Republican. And Republican is a right wing, and Republicans will not, of course, tax the rich more. Obama taxed the rich more, but Trump will reverse the taxation of the rich simply because it's his ideology. They don't believe, the right-wing governments don't believe in a social welfare state. Only the Social Democrats believe in that, all right? You know, back in the 20th century, ideologies such as socialism and communism have been very popular because we had communism in Soviet Union, but it fell down in 1989. Starting with 1989, the Eastern Europe was also under the satellite of the Soviet Union, and it started to fall down. And now, of course, we have Russia. We don't have a Soviet Union. So the communism went down. But as an ideology, it remained just like fascism. You know, fascism also was ideology of Mussolini, Italy's Mussolini, or Mussolini's Italy. But then it's not, we don't have a fascist state now as we had like Mussolini's. So communism and fascism appeared after the First World War, between the First World War and then the Second World War. The fascist and Nazi regime was defeated by the Second World War, but the Soviet Union continued to exist as a communist states, continued to exist until 1990s, and then the bloc fell down, and then the communist, what it claims to be communist totalitarian regimes, now we have North Korea, but it's very distinct, it's very getting less and less. All right. And this is about communism and fascism. Now, political economic grit. I think this is also quite well of a continuum. You can see how democratic socialism, or as I told you, social democrats, are kind of at the left, and democrat capitalism, they do value liberties, liberal values, but they are at the right because they are economically, they are not in favor of more equal society, whereas social democrats are more in favor of more equal society. Whereas, as you can see at the bottom, the maximum political control, as it goes, fascism and communism is on the side of a political control thing, because both communist regimes and fascist regimes, I told you that earlier, although they claim to have a different ideology, all right, fascism is very nationalist and communism is supposed to be international, although they have one of them is right-wing, fascism, and communism is left-wing, and they're the extremes of both the left and right, they tend toward the maximum political control instead of political freedom, because I told you that these regimes were quite totalitarian, they were quite oppressive, although they were at the opposite end of the spectrum. So it's good to remember and build a vocabulary based on this the chart that I just mentioned. All right, communism, socialism, liberalism. Liberalism is basically, I told you that before, John Locke is the father of classical liberalism, of classical political liberalism. And you remember John Locke, right? That he considered life, liberty, and property as the inalienable rights that you can't take from an individual. So liberalism, when we say liberalism, we mean a philosophy that supports guarantees of individual freedom, political change, and social reform. Because you remember, John Locke was saying that if an absolutist king tries to take or tramples or violates those three rights, then you have the right to rebel and restore these freedoms. So liberalism is kind of a progressive in that sense because it guarantees, it puts a lot of emphasis on individual freedom and social reform. A conservatism, which I told and I mentioned, conservatives, Republicans are conservatives in US, I told you. We have a conservative government in UK. We have conservative government or right-wing government in every country. And conservative, a philosophy that supports traditional order, resists political or social change. Well, there's more to that, but yeah, conservatives comes from the word conversation, conserve. So it's conserving. Fascism, again, I talk about fascism in Italian, Mussolini, Italy. Authoritarian political belief characterized by extreme nationalism, reliance on military power to achieve national goals, and state-controlled private enterprise economy. And that's the fascism. All right? So these are some questions for you to reflect on. Traditional continuum, in the second one, what are the strengths and weaknesses of traditional continuum? Traditional continuum, what he means by the left-right cleavage, all right? That's the traditional continuum. It's the left-right cleavage, which we covered, and it's based on economic. I told you two criteria: economic and politic. You know, and reflect on political and economic system. Reflect on how Aristotle classified them. Now, for a left wing, for a social democrats, political liberties are good political system, and economically speaking, more distributive, more equal economic system is a better system. Whereas for right-wing Republicans or conservatives, political system shouldn't give too much liberties sometimes, and it should let the individual get more benefit and more benefit. It shouldn't stress so much social welfare. And that would be the end of our lecture 6. In this lecture, we covered the left-right continuum, and we will continue to do that in a different way in the coming lecture. Thank you very much. Have a good day.